Imagine waking up one morning to find the sky above you cloaked in a strange, unnatural darkness, as if the sun itself had forgotten to rise. Imagine the chill in the air growing heavier, the warmth of summer suddenly stolen away, the crops failing beneath an endless gray veil that suffocates the earth. And this is just the beginning. This was the world in the year 536, a year that historians have called the worst year to be alive, a time when life became a slow, grinding struggle against forces unseen, a time when hope dimmed as quickly as the light itself. What caused this catastrophe? How did ordinary people endure the unimaginable? What did they eat when their fields lay barren? How did they find moments of joy or distraction in a world slipping into shadow? This story will unravel the chilling truth about the year 536 and the dark centuries that followed, painting a vivid picture of a time so bleak it haunts the memories of history itself. If you enjoy these deep, slow journeys into forgotten times, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to never miss a moment of boring history for sleep. Your comments help keep the story alive, so leave your thoughts below as we begin to step softly into this shadowed past. The year 536 was unlike any other, a turning point that many did not survive to see the end of, though few would have imagined the darkness ahead when the year began. The sun, usually a reliable witness to the passing days, became obscured by a thick, dusty veil stretching across the skies of Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, dimming the daylight to a strange, eerie twilight even at midday. Some described it as a dry fog that blocked the warmth of the sun, chilling the land in early summer, leaving crops unable to ripen, rivers cold and sluggish, and the air filled with an unsettling heaviness. The causes of this phenomenon were a mystery to those who lived through it, but modern science has since traced this cloak of darkness to massive volcanic eruptions whose ash clouds drifted high into the atmosphere, blotting out the light and changing the climate on a global scale. Life in 536 was defined by this unrelenting cold and darkness, but it was also defined by the quiet resilience of the people who faced each day without knowing if the next would bring warmth or starvation. Farmers, once confident in the rhythms of planting and harvesting, found their fields barren or filled with stunted, withered plants. The staple foods of the time, barley, wheat, rye, failed to grow in the shortened, cold seasons, while the pastures that fed livestock shriveled under the pale sun. The livestock, too, weakened and died in many regions, leaving families desperate for food. People scavenged for roots, nuts, and whatever wild herbs might still grow in sheltered places, often boiling these meager finds into thick, bitter broths that barely sustained life. The scent of smoke from burning would mingle with the acrid taste of ash in the air, a reminder that the earth itself was wounded. Amidst the scarcity and cold, daily routines slowed but did not vanish. Villages huddled close together, sharing what little they had, while fires burned low in stone hearths, offering fragile warmth. The sounds of children's laughter, though faint, echoed softly as they played simple games, using sticks and stones in mimicry of the hunters and warriors they might one day become. Storytelling became a cherished escape, as elders recalled tales of better times, weaving stories that could momentarily lift the spirit from the grim reality. Yet even the oldest stories seemed to fade beneath the oppressive silence of the dimmed world. The usual festivals marking the changing seasons were subdued or abandoned, for there was little reason to celebrate when the land itself refused to give life. In the cities, the streets grew quieter. Markets, once vibrant with merchants and farmers trading fresh goods, found fewer customers as scarcity tightened its grip. Bakers struggled with insufficient grain, offering small, dense loaves that barely satisfied hunger. Brewers, who once crafted ale and mead to warm the spirits of townsfolk, faced dwindling supplies. Even the simple pleasures of salted fish or dried fruits became rarities. People relied heavily on preserved foods stored from better times, but these reserves dwindled quickly under the strain of widespread famine. The social fabric began to fray, as neighbors eyed each other with suspicion over shared resources and whispered fears of what the next season might bring. Beyond Europe, reports from Asia and the Middle East tell of similar hardships. Chronicles from Chinese scholars describe darkened skies and bitter cold, while Byzantine records tell of a mysterious dust cloud that dimmed the sun and chilled the land. Trade routes, lifelines connecting distant peoples and goods, faltered as caravans slowed or stopped altogether. With movement curtailed, news and supplies from afar became scarce, and communities became more isolated, turning inward to survive. Despite the growing desperation, people clung to routines and small comforts. In many homes, simple meals of porridge made from whatever grain or roots were available were accompanied by quiet prayers or offerings to the gods. Seeking protection and relief, the crafting of textiles, the carving of wood, and the mending of tools continued, acts that maintained a fragile sense of normalcy. Music, often played on flutes or simple stringed instruments, filled the quiet evenings with soft, mournful melodies, a balm for weary hearts. The year 536 was not just a year of darkness and cold, but the start of a prolonged crisis that would ripple through centuries, causing widespread famine, social upheaval, and even the spread of disease. Yet the story of this dark time is not simply one of despair. It is a story of endurance, of communities adapting in the face of overwhelming odds, of the human spirit's stubborn refusal to surrender even when the sun hides behind a shroud of dust and ash. As we step deeper into this shadowed world, you will come to understand the delicate threads that held life together when the earth itself seemed to turn against its children. We will explore how people found food, how they sought comfort, and what it truly meant to live through what some have called the worst year to be alive. The silence of the sun was only the beginning, and the story that follows is both haunting and strangely beautiful in its raw depiction of survival as the year unfolded. The strange twilight persisted, casting a dull, muted glow over the land that seemed to swallow the vibrancy of life itself. It was not merely a change in weather or a passing storm, but a profound disruption to the natural order. The crops that farmers had planted with hope in their hearts failed to mature. Wheat stalks remained thin and pale, barely standing against the cold winds that swept mercilessly across open fields. Barley and rye, staples of the diet, shriveled before they could produce grain, leaving nothing but disappointment and dread. This was no ordinary season, no simple unlucky harvest. It was as if the very breath of the earth had been stolen away, replaced by an endless chill that gnawed at both body and soul. In villages scattered across Europe, families gathered close to the hearths, their faces gaunt and shadows stretched long by flickering flames. Meals, once rich with the tastes of freshly baked bread, stewed meats, and ripe fruits, shrank to the barest essentials. Many resorted to boiling wild roots and dried herbs into thick, tasteless gruels, barely enough to quell the gnawing hunger. Livestock, another vital source of nourishment, suffered terribly. Cows and sheep, weakened by lack of pasture, fell ill or perished, and with them the precious supplies of milk, cheese, and meat dwindled. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of damp earth and smoke from wood fires burning low to conserve precious fuel. Yet, even in these desperate times, the rhythms of life persisted in subtle, almost ghostly ways. Children, their bellies hollow but their spirits not entirely broken, found small pockets of joy. They fashioned toys from scraps of cloth and bits of wood, mimicking the soldiers, farmers, and traders they saw around them. Simple games, passed down from parents to their offspring, provided fleeting escapes from hunger and fear. In the quiet evenings, families huddled together to share stories, tales of past heroes, legends of distant lands, and whispered hopes for better days. The oral tradition, long a foundation of cultural memory, became a fragile thread connecting generations amidst uncertainty. Trade routes that had once thrived with the exchange of spices, textiles, and metals slowed to a crawl or ceased entirely. The Mediterranean ports, normally bustling with ships carrying goods from as far as India and Africa, saw fewer vessels crossing their waters. Caravan routes across Asia suffered similar fates as merchants faced perils not only from the harsh climate, but also from desperate bandits and collapsing economies. The scarcity of food and resources fueled tensions between communities, sometimes erupting in violence as people fought over what little remained. Yet, many sought peace in small acts of generosity, sharing grain, tending to the sick, and banding together to face the common threat. Cities, with their crowded streets and marketplaces, became shadows of their former selves. In the Byzantine capital of Constantinople, the streets echoed with the footsteps of weary citizens, their faces etched with worry. Food prices soared as scarcity tightened its grip, and bread lines grew longer each day. Markets, once vibrant with colorful stalls and the clamor of haggling voices, quieted under the weight of famine. Bakers struggled to bake loaves from coarse, mixed grains, often supplemented with ground bark or straw to stretch the dwindling flour supplies. Alehouses and taverns, centers of social life, dimmed their lights as patrons vanished, unable to afford even a small cup of beer or wine. Despite the bleakness, religious life continued with fervor. People turned to their faiths seeking solace and answers. In churches and temples, candles burned dimly as priests and monks offered prayers for deliverance, for the return of the sun's warmth and the earth's bounty. Some believed the dark skies were a sign of divine punishment, a call to repentance for sins long ignored. Pilgrimages, though dangerous and difficult, still drew those desperate for hope or miracles, threading through the lands like faint lifelines. Monasteries, often self-sufficient and fortified, became refuges not only for the devout but also for the hungry and sick, where the rituals of daily worship offered structure in an unsteady world. Far from the centers of power, in the forests and hills, small communities adapted as best they could. Hunting, once a seasonal supplement, became a lifeline as wild animals grew more important for survival. Deer, boar, and rabbits provided much-needed meat, though they too became scarce under the strain. Gathering wild berries, nuts, and roots required knowledge and courage, for the forest was not only a source of sustenance but also of danger. Wolves, bears, and other predators roamed closer to human settlements, driven by hunger as well. The delicate balance between human and nature shifted, forcing a harsh reckoning with survival instincts. The changes in climate also affected health in ways subtle and catastrophic. Cold and malnutrition weakened the population's immune defenses, making diseases more deadly and outbreaks more frequent. Although the Great Plague that would later devastate Europe was still centuries away, smaller epidemics of fever and infection spread quietly but relentlessly. Poor sanitation and crowded living conditions in towns worsened the impact, and those already weakened by hunger found little strength to resist. Death became a constant companion, and mourning took new forms as entire families vanished, their names lost to time. Yet, amid the shadows, moments of human ingenuity and endurance emerged. Craftsmen, faced with limited resources, fashioned tools and utensils from bones, stones, and salvaged metals. Potters mixed whatever clay and temper they could find to make vessels that would store the precious water and scarce foodstuffs. Women, who bore the brunt of feeding families, became masters of preserving what little was available, drying, smoking, and fermenting in the hopes that these methods would extend life through harsh winters. These quiet acts of survival, though often overlooked, formed the backbone of daily existence. Entertainment, too, persisted in fragile forms. Music, played softly on flutes made of bone or reed, provided moments of fleeting escape from the harshness of life. Simple dances around the fire, clapping and stamping feet in rhythm, carried echoes of celebration and hope even when laughter was scarce. Storytellers wove their narratives carefully, balancing the grim realities with the promise of heroes who might yet save the day or bring renewal. These cultural threads held communities together, binding people with shared memory and whispered dreams. As the months dragged on, it became clear that this darkness was not a mere anomaly, but the start of a profound shift, one that would linger for years to come. The scars it left on the land and its people were deep and lasting, influencing everything from agriculture to politics, from social structures to religious beliefs. But through it all, the human spirit flickered stubbornly, refusing to be extinguished even when the sun hid behind a veil of ash and dust. This was a world where survival meant more than just enduring hunger or cold. It meant maintaining hope when the very sky seemed to betray you. It meant finding light in the deepest darkness, and it meant holding on to the stories that connected the past, the present, and the uncertain future. The year 536 was the first chapter in a saga of struggle and resilience that would echo through history, reminding us that even in the worst of times, life finds a way to persist. The lingering shadow that settled over the earth in 536 did more than chill the air and wither the fields. It reshaped the very fabric of daily life in ways both subtle and profound, touching every corner of existence from the humblest village hearth to the grandest palace halls. Imagine the slow, grinding adjustments made by families forced to rethink the simplest acts of survival. Waking before dawn to tend meager fires, rationing the last bits of grain carefully weighed against the pressing hunger of children whose small bodies trembled with cold, and gathering around rough-hewn tables where meals had dwindled to unrecognizable forms of sustenance. The familiar rhythms that once marked the passage of seasons, planting, harvesting, festivals, and feast days, were interrupted, replaced by anxious whispers of scarcity and cautious hope that the earth might yet yield life. The lingering shadow that settled over the earth in 536 did more than chill the air and wither the fields. It reshaped the very fabric of daily life in ways both subtle and profound, touching every corner of existence from the humblest village hearth to the grandest palace halls. Imagine the slow, grinding adjustments made by families forced to rethink the simplest acts of survival. Waking before dawn to tend meager fires, rationing the last bits of grain carefully weighed against the pressing hunger of children whose small bodies trembled with cold, and gathering around rough-hewn tables where meals had dwindled to unrecognizable forms of sustenance. The familiar rhythms that once marked the passage of seasons, planting, harvesting, festivals, and feast days, were interrupted, replaced by anxious whispers of scarcity and cautious hope that the earth might yet yield life. Fields once lush and green lay fallow, their soil hardened by cold and covered with a layer of ash that settled like a thin shroud, as if the sky had fallen and left its weight upon the land. Farmers, whose knowledge was deeply tied to the cycles of sun and rain, watched helplessly as their crops failed to mature. Barley and rye, grains that sustained countless families, grew spindly and pale, their ears empty or filled with shriveled seeds. Wheat, the golden crown of the fields, refused to ripen, and with it vanished the bread that was the heart of every meal. The loss was not only of food but of security, for grain stores meant survival through winter and lean years. Their depletion spelled a slow, grinding desperation. The silence of the fields was echoed in the quiet desperation of the stables and pastures where animals, too, suffered the cruel bite of famine. Cattle, sheep, and goats, vital for their meat, milk, and wool, weakened under the scant grazing that remained. Many succumbed to starvation or illness, their bodies growing frail beneath thinning coats. Without their livestock, families lost more than food. They lost clothing, warmth, and even tools fashioned from bones and hides. Horses, essential for transport and labor, dwindled in number, making the movement of goods and people more difficult, further isolating communities. The cycle of dependency tightened like a noose, each loss compounding the next. Food, once an abundance of varied flavors and textures, became a study in survival through whatever means possible. People gathered what roots, nuts, and wild greens they could find, often bitter, fibrous, or unfamiliar. But these meager gifts from nature were rarely enough. Porridges thickened with ground bark or mixed with whatever seeds could be salvaged became common, their taste a dull echo of better times. Hunting increased, but game was scarcer as animals either fled the dying forests or fell victim to hunger themselves. Fish, when accessible, became a precious resource, caught from rivers and lakes by those with the knowledge and tools, offering a rare taste of protein amid the monotony of grain and greens. In the dim light of long, cold evenings, families sought warmth and comfort beside hearth fires, whose flames were precious and fiercely guarded. Wood, the primary fuel, became scarce, harvested from increasingly distant forests as local supplies diminished. The smoke from these fires carried a bittersweet aroma, part warmth, part warning, as villagers balanced the need to cook and heat with the imperative to conserve what remained. Hearthside, stories told by elders took on new importance, weaving threads of memory and hope. Tales of heroes and distant lands carried listeners beyond the confines of their hunger and cold, while old songs hummed softly, a balm against the encroaching despair. Communities, forced together by necessity, fostered new bonds even as scarcity bred suspicion and fear. Sharing what little food was available became a fragile act of trust, while disputes over resources sometimes erupted into quiet tensions or open conflict. Alliances shifted as survival demanded flexibility. Some villages formed loose confederations to pool labor and resources, while others retreated into isolation, guarding their stores like precious treasures. These social shifts reshaped local power structures, elevating those who could organize or protect, while the weak often fell through the cracks. In towns and cities, the impact of 530 SIX's calamity was starkly visible. Streets that once thrived with merchants, craftsmen, and traders slowed to a somber pace. The marketplace, heart of social and economic life, held fewer stalls and fewer buyers, as the weight of famine tightened its grip on all. Bakeries, once filled with the scent of fresh bread, struggled to bake dense, coarse loaves from mixed flours or remnants. Brewing, an important craft for both nutrition and social ritual, declined sharply as barley grew scarce and fuel became precious. Taverns and alehouses, places of gathering and respite, grew quiet, their patrons fewer as coins and appetites vanished alike. Meanwhile, in the halls of rulers and the chambers of the wealthy, the shadow of 536 cast a long and unsettling pall. Courts that had once dazzled with feasts and ceremonies now faced the uncomfortable reality of famine and unrest. The flow of tribute and taxes slowed as peasants and merchants struggled to survive, forcing leaders to reconsider their hold on power and resources. Some responded with increased taxation or forced requisitioning, worsening the plight of the common folk and stirring resentment. Others attempted to mitigate suffering through grain redistribution or charitable acts, though these efforts were often insufficient or unevenly applied. The balance of power shifted subtly but significantly, the cracks in society widening beneath the strain. Religious institutions, pillars of medieval life, grew in influence as people sought answers and comfort in the face of an inexplicable crisis. Monasteries, often better stocked and fortified, served as sanctuaries offering food, shelter, and spiritual guidance. Clerics preached sermons urging repentance and piety, interpreting the darkened skies as divine warnings or punishment. Pilgrimages, dangerous and arduous, increased as the faithful journeyed to sacred sites, hoping for miracles or relief. Rituals and prayers became acts of both desperation and solidarity, weaving spiritual threads into the fabric of daily endurance. Across vast regions, from the frozen reaches of northern Europe to the bustling cities of Byzantium and the far-off lands of China, chroniclers recorded the strange phenomena. Skies darkened for months, crops withering, famine spreading, and disease following closely behind. The volcanic dust cloud, invisible to the naked eye, had disrupted not only agriculture but the entire climate system. Winters lengthened, summers shortened, rainfall patterns changed erratically, all combining into a perfect storm of environmental catastrophe. These shifts triggered a domino effect, undermining economies, weakening armies, and altering the course of nations. Yet, amid the hardship, the human spirit found flickers of resilience. People adapted in ways both pragmatic and profound, cultivating hardier plants when possible, trading scarce resources, and innovating methods of preservation and storage. Craftsmen labored to repair tools and make new ones from available materials, sustaining the cycles of production despite adversity. Families nurtured each other with tenderness, holding fast to rituals that maintained identity and hope. In quiet moments, music and storytelling provided not only distraction but a vital thread connecting present suffering to future possibility. The year 536 was no ordinary year. It marked the beginning of a slow unraveling and remaking of life, a turning point whose echoes would ripple through decades and centuries. It was a time when the ordinary became extraordinary through endurance, when the familiar was rendered strange by forces beyond human control. To live then was to navigate uncertainty with courage, to face the unknown with a steady heart, and to carry on, step by careful step, beneath skies forever altered, by the time the second winter following the dark summer of 536 began to settle over the land. A grim understanding had taken root in the hearts of the people. that this was not a momentary affliction of the world, not a passing year of hardship to be forgotten in stories, but rather a slow descent into a deeper and longer shadow. The sky still refused to return to its familiar brightness. Even the rare appearances of the sun through the thick haze brought little comfort, for its rays felt weak, pale, and distant, more like the ghost of sunlight than the nourishing fire that had once warmed the backs of laborers in the fields or dried the linens of washerwomen along the banks of cold rivers. What began as confusion had become adaptation, and what began as adaptation had slowly congealed into a new normal, one marked by fewer meals, shorter days, longer nights, and the lingering scent of ash that clung stubbornly to woolen cloaks and wooden walls. People no longer asked if the sun would return but rather when it might, and even that question was losing its urgency, worn away by exhaustion. It was the children who noticed it first, not the astronomical absence of light, but the emotional weight of its loss. They no longer painted with bright berries or danced in midday warmth, but instead learned to crouch near fires, their hands outstretched toward the flicker of flame as if it were a sacred thing. And in some way, perhaps it was in the countryside, where isolation was both a curse and a shield, life had taken on a rawness that stripped it of anything unnecessary. There were no festivals anymore, not because the people had forgotten how to celebrate, but because there was nothing left to offer the gods or one another. The last of the dried fruits had long since been eaten. The honey, once so precious and slow to harvest, was used to sweeten thick teas brewed from roots instead of for cakes or mead. Feasting, which had once marked the harvest moon and the solstices, now meant a pot that was not entirely empty, a night when no one went to sleep with the burn of hunger twisting in their belly. Laughter, when it came, was quiet and brief, not because it was discouraged, but because the people had learned that joy needed to be protected, used sparingly like the last stick of firewood or the final candle stub. And still, even in these bleak days, life demanded movement. The animals still needed tending, though their numbers had dwindled. Chickens that once roamed the yards freely were now precious and kept in protected coops, guarded from foxes and the increasingly daring wolves that prowled the edges of the villages, their eyes glowing faintly in the half-light of dusk. Dogs became more than companions. They were guardians, scavengers, and sometimes, when desperation pushed beyond the boundary of shame, even meat. The lines between necessity and taboo blurred as survival pressed against the walls of tradition and morality. Tools broke and had to be repaired, often using parts scavenged from older, broken things. Horseshoes were reheated and reshaped. Rope was rewoven from frayed pieces, and clothing was patched so often that the original cloth could barely be seen beneath the layers of stitching. Children wore garments that had belonged to siblings long dead, their tiny shoes stuffed with straw to fill the gaps. Every object bore the marks of hands, calloused, cracked, persistent, working not to innovate but to maintain. Innovation was a luxury of peace. These were not days of invention but of conservation, of using what remained until it could be used no more. In cities, the tension had become more visible. The poor and the rich still lived side by side, but the gap between them widened. City walls no longer felt like protection. They were cages that trapped the starving within and kept the last resources guarded by those with power and influence. Beggars no longer lined the streets with their bowls extended in silence. Instead, they formed ragged bands, wandering the alleys in search of anything left unguarded. Loaves stolen from carts, bones tossed behind taverns, the dim glow of candles in unwatched windows. Guards were posted more frequently, not to protect from foreign invaders but from one's own neighbors, whose desperation had begun to resemble rage. Even religion, which had offered a kind of anchor in the first year of the calamity, began to fracture beneath the weight of unanswered prayers. Monks in remote monasteries continued their rituals, their chants echoing through cold stone corridors, while villagers knelt before weathered icons asking why the divine had turned away. Some sects grew stronger, drawing followers with promises of hidden truth or sacred punishments that could be reversed only through sacrifice and devotion. Others splintered entirely, their leaders falling silent or disappearing into the forests to seek answers in solitude. In some regions, old pagan rites quietly resurfaced. Small offerings left at the roots of trees, whispers spoken to the wind, attempts to reach any force that might still listen. And yet, amid the stillness and mourning, the human urge to understand never truly ceased. In Constantinople, some scholars began recording the changes in weather and the reports that came from travelers and traders. Dust in the air, dimming of the sun, unseasonal frost, failed harvests, starvation, patterns. The written word, though slow and often obscured by politics and ignorance, became a silent witness to the transformation of the world. There were whispers of a massive eruption far to the north, a mountain that had belched fire and ash into the heavens, cloaking the world in deathless smoke. But such theories were distant from the lives of most. They did not explain the empty fields, the sick children, or the sense that the world had simply lost its warmth. In Asia, similar stories echoed through the records. Chinese court astronomers noted the dimming sun and harsh winters. The emperor's advisors struggled to interpret the omens. In Persia, too, reports of failing crops and restless borders painted the same tale in different ink. The darkness was global, the suffering universal, yet every people believed themselves uniquely cursed. Few could imagine that what they were experiencing was not the judgment of a local god or the punishment of their rulers, but the effect of vast, unseen forces shaking the planet itself. As the third year approached and the calendar moved forward, the people had stopped marking time by months or festivals. Now, they spoke of seasons not by names but by experiences. The long winter of wet stone and blue fingers, the hungry spring when dogs vanished, the dry summer when ash blew across the river like mist. And they waited, not for salvation, but for the next moment of calm, the next faint sign that the sky might brighten or the soil might breathe again. Because even in the worst years, life clings to the edges. A sprout found beneath a fallen log, pale but stubborn. A single egg laid in a forgotten coop. A smile between two strangers sharing the same thin broth. The year 536 had shattered the illusion of permanence, but it had not yet destroyed the quiet defiance that flickered in every corner where warmth still reached. The people endured. They were cold, they were hungry, they were afraid, but they endured. As the early months of what should have been spring crept forward under a sky that still refused to open fully, the wind remained sharp enough to draw tears from the eyes, and frost lingered in the soil long past its time, burrowing deep into the roots of any plant foolish enough to try and rise. The world, it seemed, had forgotten how to wake. Nothing grew with confidence. The days remained short, not by the ticking of the sun's arc across the heavens, but by the measure of cold that began at dawn and never lifted. Birds that once returned to mark the changing seasons remained absent or came only in small, confused flocks, their songs strangely muted. Beekeepers opened their hives to find silence, waxen chambers untouched, colonies dead or vanished. Hope, so tightly coiled within the rhythms of nature, grew thin and tired in the hearts of those who waited for signs that never came. It was in this cold half-light that people began to change not just in their habits, but in their very beliefs. When enough seasons pass without fulfillment, without renewal, the mind searches elsewhere. In the corners of wooden homes, amulets appeared that had not been seen for generations. Knotted cords, bone charms, stones marked with circles or cuts. These were not toys or decorations. They were quiet prayers carved into matter, left where smoke rose, where bread was baked, where babies were rocked to sleep. Some claimed these objects protected the household from sickness or from wolves, from hunger or from bad spirits. Others said nothing at all, simply tied them in place and moved on, because silence had become its own kind of survival. Men and women who once mocked superstition began to follow strange routines, stepping over thresholds with the left foot only, hanging feathers from doorways, burying small items near hearthstones. When reason fails to explain suffering, belief fills the space like smoke through rafters. No one said the gods had truly returned. No one dared speak of magic in the open. But there was a shift, a gentle returning to the old whispers that had lingered in the soil long before parchment and scripture had tried to name the world's order. And yet not all sought meaning in the mystical. There were those whose response to the long darkness was more immediate, more bodily. In some towns, labor gangs formed not out of coercion, but necessity. Communal grain pits were dug and guarded. Rotting wood was scavenged from abandoned homes, burned for warmth without ceremony. Children were sent out in groups to forage, boys and girls alike, wearing cloaks patched from the sleeves of their dead kin, learning how to walk silently through the woods, how to listen for the low shuffle of edible insects beneath logs, how to tell a safe mushroom from a fatal one. These were not games or lessons passed from a smiling parent by the fire. They were matters of life and death. One mistake meant sickness or worse, and so they learned quickly, with eyes wide and mouths tightly closed. In the north, where the cold bit harder, entire villages began to migrate. Not far and not in great numbers, for travel was dangerous and food was needed at every step. But still, they moved. Older folk who could no longer walk were bundled into carts or carried in woven slings. The sick were left behind with a kiss and a whispered promise that they would be remembered, that their names would not be lost. These wandering bands followed the paths of rivers or the skeletons of long-forgotten roads, seeking warmer valleys, abandoned storehouses, the kindness of monasteries. They slept in ruined towers and among the stones of collapsed barns. At night, they shared stories not of heroes or gods, but of other places, towns where, someone claimed, the harvest had not failed, where the sun had shone for 3 days without interruption, where bread was still baked daily, where no one had eaten their dog. The truth of these tales mattered little. What mattered was that they were told, that the group kept walking. Even in regions where people did not move, there was movement in the way life had to adjust. Leatherworkers began crafting goods from less traditional sources: catgut, bark, sinew. Potters experimented with new mixes of ash and clay, trying to make vessels that could withstand longer exposure to fire without breaking. Roofs were reinforced with sod or layered hides. People grew quiet when they worked, not out of sadness, but out of focus. The smallest mistake could mean wasted materials, and nothing was replaceable anymore. A single broken jar meant one fewer place to store dried meat or precious seeds. A snapped blade meant a field untended. A ripped cloak meant a night colder than the last. And yet, life continued. Babies were still born, though fewer than before. Their mothers, pale and thin, gave birth in near silence, the cries of labor muffled by straw walls and the steady breathing of anxious midwives. Infants were wrapped in scraps, their names whispered with urgency, as if the act of naming might bind them more firmly to the world. There were weddings, though they had become brief and practical affairs, often little more than the exchange of food or furs and a clasp of hands. And there were funerals, though they lacked the long processions of years past. Now the dead were buried swiftly, their bodies wrapped in the linens of their birth, returned to the same soil that had failed to nourish them. News continued to spread, slow but insistent. Messengers on tired horses, merchants with half-empty wagons, wandering monks with mud-caked sandals. They carried tales across lands. Some spoke of strange animals seen in southern lands, forced north by heat and hunger. Others described fields black with frost in midsummer or entire villages found deserted, their fires still smoldering. In the east, some said, the emperor had taken to praying daily on the palace steps, refusing meat, offering gold to the temples. In the far north, warriors were said to be gathering again, sensing weakness in their neighbors. War, it seemed, was never far away, not even when the world itself was on its knees. But in most places, survival left little room for politics or conquest. Each family became its own world, each fire a miniature sun, fragile and sacred. Dreams were not of power or fame, but of warmth, of full bellies, of a day without aching joints or empty storage jars. Children who once imagined themselves as knights or saints now dreamed only of finding a single unspoiled apple, of sleeping through the night without coughing, of walking without stepping over bones. And through all of this, the sky remained strange. On some days it turned red, on others yellowish gray, as if stained by unseen hands. Stars became harder to see, their light dulled by a haze that clung even at night. Travelers who once navigated by constellations now walked with caution, guided by rivers and mountains instead. The moon, pale and distant, hung like a forgotten coin in the sky, offering no answers. There was still no name for what had happened. The people of the 6th century did not know the term volcanic winter. They did not know that somewhere, perhaps in Iceland or North America, a mountain had torn itself open and hurled its insides into the sky, blanketing the earth in sulfur and soot. They did not know that the cold they felt, the dark they feared, had begun with fire. All they knew was what they felt, what they saw, what they carried. The sun had dimmed, the harvests had failed, the children cried through the night, and no one could remember a time when things had been otherwise. But still they endured. By the 4th year of diminished light, time itself had begun to feel unreliable. Calendars, once carefully maintained by monks and officials who recorded the rise and fall of days with solemn devotion, were now riddled with uncertainty. Dates blurred as the familiar cues of nature no longer arrived on schedule. The spring rains came late or not at all. The snow melted too early in some places, or clung far too long in others, turning fields into mud pits or hard-crusted plains where nothing could take root. The rhythms of planting and harvesting, once known even by children, had unraveled, leaving entire communities unsure of what day it was or whether time itself had become unmoored from its path. And yet people continued to count. Not months, not festivals, not saints' days, but the number of failed harvests, the number of children lost, the number of times they had seen the river freeze deeper than before. Time was measured in losses now. In the southern hill villages, they spoke of the year of empty cellars, followed by the year of gray fire, when smoke no longer rose high but curled low and thick, choking the valley like a silent flood. In northern coastal settlements, they whispered about the winter without seals, when even the ocean stopped giving. Language shifted subtly, reorganizing itself around what had been lost. In these years, even death began to look different. Where once it had been an event, marked by ritual, by procession, by wailing and remembrance, it had become quieter, more practical, almost inevitable. Graves were dug shallow to save strength. Some bodies were buried together, especially when a family had no one left to mourn them. Wooden markers, carved with names or symbols, became rare luxuries. In many places, graves went unmarked, returning the dead to the earth without fanfare. But even in this quiet, there remained gestures, small human touches. A mother who tucked a woven doll into her child's burial shroud. A brother who wrapped his sister's hands in a cloth he'd saved from their first winter. A friend who stayed beside the grave until the last stone was laid. The cities by now had changed shape. Walls once meant for protection began to look like barriers holding in suffering. Markets still operated, but only sporadically. No longer places of abundance or negotiation, they had become shadowy places of silent exchange. Salted meat traded for wool, dried roots swapped for broken tools. Coins still passed between hands, but with less meaning, their metal value outweighed by the immediate usefulness of whatever could be carried away and consumed. Fewer merchants arrived from distant lands. Fewer pilgrims sought holy places. Roads grew quieter, their milestones weathered and unused. Some leaders tried to maintain order. In the eastern cities, civic announcements were posted on wooden boards, requesting calm, urging faith, promising relief. But few listened. What used were proclamations when there was no bread to give, no seed to plant, no light to read them by. In some towns, leaders tried to organize granaries, stockpiles, controlled rationing. In a handful of places, these efforts saved lives. In many others, they ended in failure, as those with power hoarded more, while those without found themselves outside locked gates, told to wait for a hope that never came. And then came the locusts. No one had expected it. After years of cold and failed crops, of ash in the sky and dying livestock, few could have imagined a swarm descending like a black curtain over what little had managed to grow. But they came relentless and hungry, in regions where a late, stubborn harvest had finally begun to show promise, green shoots barely peeking from cracked soil. The locusts arrived in waves. They stripped the fields bare in hours, devouring not just crops but bark, cloth, leather. Stories spread of villagers watching helplessly as their last chance at survival vanished beneath a cloud of wings and a constant, rustling sound that filled the ears long after the swarm had passed. Some blamed divine punishment. Others said the earth itself had turned against them. Still others said nothing at all, having lost even the strength to wonder. But among the ruins of those stripped fields, among the twisted stalks and shredded leaves, people still knelt to gather whatever remained. Scraps of seed, a handful of beetles, anything that could be boiled, dried, ground into something that looked like food. The line between nourishment and poison blurred. Hunger did not ask questions. In the villages where people still held counsel, decisions had grown harsher. Every mouth counted. Every hand was measured. In some places, those too weak to work were quietly left behind. In others, the elderly volunteered to walk away, not out of hopelessness, but out of fierce love for their kin. They walked slowly into the woods or out onto the moors, carrying with them no fear, only the quiet understanding that fewer mouths might mean survival for the rest. No one spoke of these things openly. They were known, not named. And so, life continued, narrowed down to the barest essentials. Water, fire, shelter, quiet. But even in this bleakness, small things remained. Someone still repaired shoes because feet must still walk. Someone still carved bone needles because torn clothes still needed mending. Someone still sang, not loudly, not with joy, but with memory. A tune their mother had hummed while grinding grain. A melody once played on flute at a midsummer feast. Music was no longer for dancing. It was for remembering, for anchoring the self to something before the darkness. In monasteries, the scribes kept writing. Their ink froze in winter, their fingers cracked from the cold, but still they copied texts. Records of what was happening, prayers, fragments of medicine, letters from cities that no longer existed. Some began recording not only scripture but weather patterns, sky colors, reports from travelers. Their pages, tucked safely behind thick stone walls, would one day tell others what it had meant to live through these years. They didn't know if anyone would ever read them. They wrote anyway, and then, very slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, there were whispers of change. Not relief, not warmth, but difference. Somewhere, in a valley hidden from the worst winds, someone said the river had thawed early. Somewhere else, someone else claimed their last grain had sprouted despite the cold. 2 towns apart, and still the same story. A single green plant, rising tall, untouched by frost, shining faintly under a still dim sun. It wasn't proof. It wasn't a miracle, but it was something. Not all heard these whispers. Not all believed them. But for those who did, the idea was enough. That somewhere out there, the earth had stirred again. That maybe, just maybe, the sky had begun to open. In the 5th year, people no longer looked toward the heavens with anger or expectation. They had learned not to search the skies for signs of mercy, for warmth, for light. The sun, when it appeared, seemed weary of its task. Rising late, sinking early, its rays thin like threadbare cloth stretched across a frame. It did not warm skin or soil. It merely existed, a dim presence above, something to be noted but not trusted. And yet, for reasons unknown even to the most patient watchers of the world, the air felt different. Slightly, not warmer, not exactly, but not quite as sharp. The wind still cut, but not as deep. The frost still gathered on windows, but it melted by midday, rather than clinging until nightfall. It was nothing to be celebrated, and yet people noticed it. Quietly, in a village surrounded by crumbling stone walls, a woman stepped outside one morning and stood without shivering. Her breath still curled in the air, but her fingers didn't burn with cold the way they had all those previous mornings. She didn't say anything. She simply stood, listened to the creak of trees in the wind, and noticed that there were more birds than usual. Not many, just a few, but their calls sounded less hollow. She turned back inside and told no one. Not yet. It was too early to name what she felt. In a distant valley, a boy crouched in the mud where a stream had begun to move again. He watched as water trickled over stone, thin and hesitant. The flow was weak, but it was clean. He cupped his hands and drank, and the cold of it didn't make his teeth ache the way it had in winters past. He filled his sack with moss and wet roots and walked back slowly, wondering if maybe the stories had been right, if the earth had turned, not all at once, not with a great trumpet blast or a burst of color, but with a whisper. No proclamations marked this moment. No banners were hung. No bells were rung. But in a dozen villages scattered across the land, people began to talk again. Not just about dying or enduring or surviving, but about planting. Not tomorrow, not today, but soon. Soon was a new word, one that hadn't been spoken in years without bitterness. Carried the weight of possibility. It didn't promise, but it offered. Still, caution outweighed hope. Seeds had become more precious than gold. A handful of barley grains might mean life if stored or death if wasted in bad soil. Those who still had seed stock consulted with elders and weathered calendars. They tasted the earth, checked its softness, watched the sky for birds and clouds. Every decision carried risk, but something had shifted. The ground no longer resisted touch in quite the same way. And as the land began to show the faintest signs of renewal, so too did the people. Not quickly, not joyfully, but steadily. Tools long wrapped in cloth were unwrapped and sharpened. Hoes with splintered handles were bound with cord. Buckets were patched, baskets rewoven. The bones of old barns were dragged upright, braced against wind. Plow animals were few, and many of those still alive were too weak to labor. So men and women took up the yoke themselves, pulling blades through frozen ground with slow, stubborn steps. And when they planted in silence. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't reverence. It was respect for the earth, for the seed, for the years they had survived to reach this moment. Each motion was deliberate. Seeds pressed into soil, water carried in jars. There was no ceremony, only quiet focus. And when the first green shoot appeared, one thin, trembling strand of life, people did not cry out in joy. They watched it, waited to see if it would curl or stand, if it would hold against the wind. Then another sprout came, and another. Cabbage, beans, barley, not fields, not yet, but patches, gardens, possibilities. Evenings began to change. Families still gathered by the fire, but now there were more conversations about repairs, plans, future tasks. Songs returned. Not the joyous ones of festival days, but the work songs, the memory songs, the ones that helped the hands move faster. Children, some of whom had never known anything but hunger, learned the names of plants, the rhythm of planting, the way to recognize good soil by the feel of it in their fingers. These were not lessons of theory but of survival. Their play became practice. Their games imitated harvest. The animals responded, too. Goats gave more milk. Chickens began to lay again. Shepherds, who had learned to measure the health of a herd by sound and smell alone, noticed a difference in the bleats, in the way the animals stood. Less lethargy, more movement. There were still deaths, of course. Disease had not vanished and cold still lingered, but the curve had shifted. There were births again, not only among the people, but among their flocks. New lambs, trembling and wet, blinked at the dim sun with wide, unsure eyes. In towns and cities, the change took longer. The damage there ran deeper. Starvation, sickness, violence, all had carved deep wounds into urban life. Many buildings stood abandoned, their doors swinging open, their walls charred by old fires. Rats scurried through silent streets. But even here, signs of life returned. A single shop reopened, its owner offering fish dried by careful smoke. A church door left ajar with candles burning inside. A marketplace where two stalls stood side by side, trading cloth for bread, both vendors watching each other with wary hope. Messengers and traders began moving again, slowly, cautiously. Roads were still dangerous, but passable. Stories spread not of destruction, but of growth. One man claimed to have eaten a fresh apple in a southern valley. A woman swore she had seen a vineyard in bloom. These tales, once dismissed as delusion, were now greeted with quiet interest. People began to ask questions again. They began to listen, and though no one could forget what had been lost, the years of hunger, the loved ones buried without words, the winters that had crushed bones and hope alike. There was, at last, something else beside the memory of suffering. A new chapter, not yet written, but waiting. The future had returned, not as certainty, but as something to walk toward. The skies, still dim, held fewer clouds. The stars, though muted, became clearer. And the moon, once pale and distant, now seemed to shine with the faintest warmth, as if it too had endured. As spring gave way to what resembled summer, not by the old standards of warm winds and long days filled with light, but by the faint easing of cold and the return of growing things, the people did not rejoice in the way their ancestors might have. There were no festivals, no garlands of flowers hanging from doorways, no music echoing across the fields. Instead, there was labor, endless, tireless, grateful labor. From the first pale green blade that emerged from the soil to the final furrow pressed by calloused hands, every hour of light was given to the work of reclaiming life from a land that had nearly forgotten how to give. No one needed to be told what to do. Instinct and necessity guided them. Fields that had lain fallow for years, their soil hardened by frost and forgotten beneath layers of ash, were now turned with care, each clump of earth lifted as if it contained something sacred. The seeds were precious. Many had been hidden away in sacks beneath floorboards, in clay pots sealed with wax, in hollowed tree trunks behind old shrines. They had been kept not because people believed they would be needed, but because they could not bear to let go of the idea that one day they might matter again. And now that day had arrived. Old men who had once taught young boys to fish now crouched beside the planting rows with trembling fingers, whispering advice not as instruction, but as hope passed down like a candle from one hand to another. Women who had woven baskets in silence now sang to the rhythm of planting, their voices low and strong, their eyes never lifting from the soil. Children, who had only known hunger as a constant rhythm of existence, began to understand something else. The shape of a root beneath their fingers, the feel of damp dirt that smelled not of rot but of growth, the joy of seeing a single bean push through the ground and unfurl its first tiny leaves. In many places, water still ran shallow, and the rivers could no longer be trusted to nourish as they once had. But people adapted. Channels were dug, buckets carried in long trains across hills. Wells were deepened, and those who remembered the old ways of finding underground springs became valued again. Every drop mattered, and it was poured not wastefully, but with reverence, like oil in a sacred lamp. The forests, too, began to stir. What had been silent and lifeless now hummed with the quiet rustling of small creatures returning. Rabbits, lean but quick, darted between thickets. Birds nested in trees that had only just begun to sprout fresh leaves. The ash that had once choked every surface was now mixed with the soil, its bitterness fading beneath the efforts of wind and rain. Trees that had been felled for firewood during the darkest winters began to show green shoots at their bases. Saplings emerged along the forest edges, thin but insistent, as though the land itself had taken a breath it had long forgotten. And yet, not all had survived to see it. Entire villages had vanished, swallowed not by war or fire, but by time, by abandonment, by the slow dispersal of those who could no longer stay. Roads leading to nowhere wound through empty fields. Fences stood without purpose. Churches without congregations leaned against the wind, their bells missing, their windows broken, their pews coated in dust and silence. The names of those places lingered only in the memories of a few, old shepherds who had once traded in their markets, monks who still marked them in faded ledgers, travelers who recalled a place where the bread had once been sweet and the roofs had been red. But in the places where life continued, even just barely, the changes ran deeper than the return of green. People were different, not just thinner or quieter, but inwardly changed. They moved with more care, spoke less, listened more. Arguments, when they came, were short and often ended with a shared task, as if both parties knew that anger was a luxury the world no longer afforded. There was no room for pride when grain still grew uncertain and roofs still leaked. Trust became the new currency. Shared tools, shared labor, shared food. A man who lent his axe without question was worth more than one who held on to gold. A woman who watched a neighbor's children while she harvested was treated like kin. and gradually stories returned. Not the desperate tales of survival, not the recounting of loss and frost and hunger, but stories with roots in something deeper. Elders began to tell of the time before the skies had dimmed, not as a dream but as a legacy. They spoke of bright summers and warm nights, of trees so full of apples their branches bent low, of markets where spices had once perfumed the air, of sea voyages where ships returned heavy with salt and silk and strange fruits. Younger listeners sat quietly, not because they disbelieved, but because they needed to hold on to the idea that such a world had once existed, and might, with care, be called back. Some of these stories took on new shapes. In them, the darkness became a dragon that had coiled around the earth, asleep and angry, its breath thick with ash and ice. The people, brave and patient, had not slain it with swords, but endured its presence with silent courage, until the beast tired and uncoiled, slinking back into the mountains where it came from. These were not tales of conquest, but of quiet resistance. And in that resistance, children learned that strength was not always loud or glorious, but could be found in the soft persistence of planting seeds even when unsure they would grow. And in the churches, too, the sermons changed. The priests still spoke of suffering, of penance and faith, but they now emphasized the endurance of the soul, the reward of patience, the holiness of daily labor. Bread, once taken for granted, became sacramental in its making. Water blessed not just in baptism, but in each cup poured. And fire, kept carefully burning in hearths and lamps, was treated not just as warmth, but as a reminder of light returning, of the long night finally, slowly, beginning to lift. By the end of that summer, harvest was not plentiful, but it was real. Baskets filled, not overflowing, but full enough. Grain was dried on cloths in the sun. Herbs were strung above doors. Roots were buried in cellars. The cellars, empty for so long, once again held the smell of storage, of waiting, of the quiet expectation that winter would come. But that this time, it would be met with something more than fear. The people had not won. They had endured. And from that endurance, something stronger than celebration emerged, a kind of sacred ordinariness, a trust in labor, a belief in the body's ability to bend and not break, a hope not spoken loudly, but carried like a warm stone in the pocket, held close, passed hand to hand, and never dropped. Autumn came not with fanfare, not with the crisp joy remembered from the world that had existed before the sky dimmed, but with a quiet, amber slowness. The days remained short, the sun still more rumor than presence, and the wind whispered always of the long cold ahead. But there was fruit on the trees, small, firm, cautious fruit that ripened slowly beneath filtered light. The fields, though not golden as in stories, had bent beneath the weight of barley, of beans, of flax. It wasn't abundance, but it was enough. And for people who had forgotten what enough even felt like, that was everything. They harvested without singing, but not without rhythm. Hands that had learned to survive now moved with a kind of grace. The scythe sliced clean. The grain was gathered into tight bundles. The roots were pulled and shaken and stored. Every vegetable held weight beyond nourishment. It was a symbol, a promise that the land could still give, that the sky had not withdrawn forever. Even the smallest tuber, even the thinnest stalk of leeks, was handled gently, respectfully, as if it might vanish if held too roughly. The harvest was never wasted. Cracked grains were ground and cooked into pastes. Wilted leaves were stewed until their bitterness softened. Apple skins, boiled and dried, became treats for children who had never known sugar. Nothing was discarded, not a stem, not a stone, not a thread of chaff. What could not be eaten was burned for fuel or buried to feed the soil. And when at last the storing was done, when the root cellars had been filled and the last crates sealed with damp straw, people did not dance or feast. They sat together, their backs to the fire, and allowed themselves to feel full, to feel safe, if only for a night. That winter, for the first time in years, they were prepared. And yet, fear does not vanish just because it is not needed. The cold still came, and with it the memories of nights without food, of infants who had not survived, of wolves closer than they should have been. Even as they huddled with stores beneath them, even as the fires burned longer and the soups bubbled with real vegetables, many could not sleep easily. They listened for signs in the wind. They watched the sky for another change. They waited, not for disaster, but for the return of absence, because absence had become their most familiar companion. But the sky did not darken further. The snow came in its time, not early, not heavy, but steady. The trees did not split with frost. The wind howled, yes, but not with the sharpness of the years before. It was cold, but not cruel. The rivers froze, but only at their edges. The animals curled in close to the houses and barns, pressing their breath into straw. And inside, by candlelight or the faint glow of embers, the people told their stories, not of kings or saints, not of great battles or holy miracles, but of cabbage, of millet, of the seed that grew after 4 years in hiding, of the man who rebuilt his barn using the stones from 3 ruined homes, of the woman who found a wild beehive in a hollow tree and took only what she needed, of the child who spoke to the sky and said, "You are still here." These stories were not dramatic. They were not meant to inspire awe, but they were repeated again and again because in their repetition was something deeper than memory, a binding, a stitching together of broken days. And in those quiet months of snow and smoke, new habits formed, not out of desperation, but from a cautious desire to preserve what had returned. Communal granaries were sealed and guarded. Families, once isolated, began to trade again. A pot of thick soup left on a neighbor's doorstep. A woolen wrap sewn for a child not one's own. These acts were not charity. They were investments in survival, not just physical but emotional, communal. The old idea of the village had returned, not as a place, but as a shared will. In distant monasteries, the monks took note of the change. Their writings, once filled with omens and despair, began to reflect something else. Not joy, not triumph, but patience. They recorded the dates of thaw, the frequency of birdsong, the weight of vegetables grown. They noted when the bees returned, how the frost arrived later, how the clouds seemed higher. These were not miracles. They were evidence. The world was not healed, but it was no longer falling. And with this slow recovery came a different kind of movement. Travelers began appearing again, not many, and not with great purpose, but with questions. What grows here now? What do you trade? Have the fish returned? Can we stay just for a few nights? And the answers varied. Some places welcomed them. Others, still scarred by famine and theft, closed their gates. But slowly, the pathways between places began to open. Footprints appeared on old Roman roads. Horse hooves pressed patterns into trails long covered in weeds. And where there were roads, there was talk. Of what had been lost, yes, but also of what had been found. In one valley, a man claimed to have made bread with wild yeast and barley that hadn't failed. In another, a woman had dyed cloth again, using crushed berries and flower petals that had only recently dared to bloom. Someone carried news of a great market being planned, just a small one, just for a day, just to trade tools and seed. But it was the idea that mattered. The idea that there could be a day set aside not for grieving, not for hiding, not even for surviving, but for gathering. And so, when spring came again, more certain this time, with stronger rains and a sun that lingered longer each day, the world did not return to what it had been. Could not. Too much had changed. Too many voices were missing from the tables. Too many songs could not be sung. Too many places remained empty. But it moved forward. The plows dug deeper. The grain grew thicker. The people did not celebrate. They worked, but they worked with something new in their chests. Not joy, not even hope, but steadiness. The 6th year arrived not as an event, but as a breath, slow, unnoticed, and deeply needed. No bells rang to mark its beginning. No banners were raised. But those who had endured the hollow years of ash and silence knew the shape of change now. It did not crash like a wave or rise like thunder. It crept, low and steady, through the roots and the branches and the skin of the world, until even the most cautious souls began to admit what they dared not say aloud for so long. The worst had passed. Not vanished, not undone, but passed. And yet, with survival came questions. Not just about what had caused the sky to darken. Not just about the trembling edge between life and hunger, but deeper questions, slower ones. What did it mean to live, now that living was no longer simply enduring? What would be carried forward from the long cold, and what would be buried alongside those who hadn't made it? There were no answers yet, but there were signs. The rhythm of the seasons, once broken, now began to settle. Not perfectly, not as before, but with enough consistency that the people began to plan again. Fields were mapped out with purpose. Grains were rotated. New seeds were tested. The labor was still hard, still bruising to the back and raw to the hands, but it was no longer desperate. Each furrow pressed into the earth was not just a gamble, but a decision, a quiet vote for continuity. And in the spaces between labor, culture began to stir. Not loudly, not in theaters or great halls, but in the corners of homes, in the whispered repetition of old songs, in the shaping of clay, in the dyeing of cloth, in the carving of wood. Beauty returned not as luxury, but as resilience. A cup with a curved handle, a tunic with a stitched border, a lullaby with a second verse. These were not excess. They were nourishment of a different kind. They told the body and the soul that survival could make space for meaning. Some of the old festivals were revived. Not the grand ones, not yet, but modest echoes. A gathering in the field after harvest, with broth and bread and a jug of weak ale passed around a circle. Children running with reeds tied to sticks. A fire lit not just for heat, but for light. People remembered how to look one another in the eye again, how to speak of the future without flinching, how to laugh. Not the nervous laugh of those distracting themselves from hunger, but the soft kind that bubbles up from fullness, from simple company. But while the people looked forward, the world itself still bore scars. Forests remained thinner than they had been. Herds had not yet returned to their former size. Villages that had once glowed with lamplight at night remained hollow, their timbers slowly collapsing into overgrown grass and moss. There were fewer people. The cough of plague had long since echoed through the land, quiet but merciless, following in the path of famine. Whole families had vanished, generations interrupted, names forgotten, and yet memory persisted, even in the mouths of children too young to remember. They had inherited the stories. They carried them not as burdens, but as tools. They had learned how to mend what was broken, how to listen when the sky changed, how to store, how to ration, how to endure. They played differently than children once had. Their games were full of trial and survival and quiet recovery. But they played. That alone was a sign. Trade returned slowly, first between neighbors, then between villages, then between regions. The old roads, worn but not erased, grew passable again. Carts rattled across them. Horses returned to work. Markets reappeared, modest and cautious, not bustling with silver and spice and saffron, but with flax and wool and bread and beeswax and sturdy shoes. Coins were used again, but rarely. Barter remained the truest currency. Skill for grain, cloth for milk, honey for salt. Trust weighed more than gold. Along the rivers, the boats came back. Smaller, quieter. No grand fleets, but rowboats, rafts, traders with hands thick from rope and eyes sharp from years watching clouds. They spoke of places where wheat had grown tall, of towns where churches had been repaired, of monks copying new books, not just preserving the old. These stories carried across the water like breath, like prayer. And far away, in cities still recovering from years of silence, ideas began to bloom once more. Philosophers stepped into the sunlight after years of hiding behind thick stone and darker thoughts. They did not speak of punishment or doom anymore. They asked questions. They tested new theories. What had darkened the sky? Why had the stars vanished for so long? What had caused the cold? There were no tools yet to measure ash in ice or sulfur in rings of trees. But the questions were seeds, and they were planted. In time, answers would come. But for now, people were content to ask, to wonder again. The land itself seemed to reward this wandering. The bees returned in greater numbers. Flowers that had not bloomed in years began to open again. Foxglove, thistle, elder. Not in great waves, but in cautious gatherings, like quiet congregations of color and scent. The forests whispered differently. Not the bare, cracking groans of cold limbs, but the creak of growth, the flutter of leaves, the sound of foxes hunting and deer stepping softly through the underbrush. Wolves still prowled. They had grown bold during the famine years. Some still wandered close to the edges of farms, sniffing for weakness, for opportunity. But they were fewer now, hungrier perhaps, but less desperate. Their howls echoed at night, but they no longer meant certain death. Just distance, just wildness still watching from the edge. And the sky, that fickle, untrustworthy sky, each month it grew clearer, bluer. At night, the stars shone again. Not all at once, but more and more. The moon regained her silver. And when children asked where the sun had gone all those years ago, their parents could finally answer without fear in their voice. They said the sky had closed her eyes, but she was waking again. Slowly, kindly. By the 7th spring, the land had healed just enough for the people to believe. Not just in crops or in seasons or in warmth, but in themselves. They were not what they had been. They were leaner, quieter, more careful, but also wiser, and they had not vanished, not even close. By the time the 7th year turned its face toward summer, people had begun to plant not only for themselves, but for others. Not just for those in their own cottages or behind their own fences, but for travelers who might pass through, for children not yet born, for neighbors too old to dig, for strangers whose names they might never know. This was not charity, nor pity, nor some soft philosophy of goodwill. It was practicality born of hardship, grown into something deeper, an understanding that survival was never meant to be a solitary act. Fields grew longer, not wider. Garden beds extended to the edges of shared paths. Fruit trees were grafted and planted near wells and crossroads, not just behind walls. In one northern hamlet, an old woman taught the children how to build a hedge around a patch of raspberries so that animals would not take them all. The children, in turn, added sticks with feathers tied to them to scare the birds, and they left a handful of berries on the lowest branches each week, not as waste but as offering for the birds, for the forest, for balance. And so the bushes grew fuller the next year. In a distant valley, a family who had lost all their kin in the 5th year chose not to wall in their new harvest, but to build benches in their garden, placing a jar of salted turnips on the edge of the table each week. No one asked why. Everyone knew. And when a group of travelers passed through in the autumn, they found bread cooling on the stone wall, covered in cloth, and they left behind 3 knives sharpened to mirror brightness in thanks. No one had taught these things. They had emerged like moss after rain, natural, soft, and deeply rooted. And it was not just food that grew. Words grew again. For many years, writing had shrunk to necessity. Records of birth and death, grain tallies, warnings carved into wood, prayers scrawled with soot on plaster. But now, paper began to be sought not just for record but for thought. Children were taught letters again, not only to read scripture, but to write their names. Monks who had spent their days copying the same psalms now took up blank vellum and began to collect stories. Not myths, not miracles, but accounts. What had been seen, what had been endured, what had been learned. And in a stone-walled school at the edge of a half-rebuilt city, a young scribe began copying an old Roman text not for preservation, but to understand what came before the dark. He added notes in the margins. He corrected what he believed were errors. And in doing so, without knowing it, he was beginning again the long conversation between past and future. Art too returned. Not the grand icons of gold and glass that once adorned cathedrals, but smaller expressions. Paint scratched into wood, pigments mixed from ash and flour, designs pressed into clay pots, stitched into linen sleeves, carved into the handles of everyday tools. A shepherd painted the image of a tree onto his staff, each branch representing a person he had lost. A midwife braided the names of every child she had helped deliver into a belt of cord she wore at each birth. A blacksmith etched a spiral into the hilt of each blade he made, not for decoration, but as reminder that time turns and returns and turns again. Even music came back, quietly, not from the high windows of churches or the halls of lords, but from the mouths of laborers. Songs hummed while grinding grain, lullabies whispered in shared beds. Drum rhythms tapped on the sides of wooden bowls while waiting for stew to boil. A flute made from hollow bone played at dusk by a boy who didn't know its history, only its sound. These sounds did not announce joy. They remembered it. They hinted at its possibility. With each passing season, old wounds were covered by new bark. Roads once broken by frost were patched with stone and brush. Bridges were rebuilt. Not all, not perfectly, but enough to walk across. Trade continued to widen its reach. The tools exchanged grew more refined. Not just needles and spindles and pots, but books, ink, combs, soap, colored wool, medicinal roots, glass beads. These were not signs of wealth, but of choice, the ability to shape a day beyond hunger. And slowly, people began to move for reasons beyond necessity. Young men and women, born in the midst of the long dark, set out from their villages not in flight, but in search. They walked toward places they'd only heard of, valleys their grandparents described, ruins now grown over with vines. Some settled where the land was kinder. Some returned with new seeds. Some didn't return at all, but sent word, scratched into bark or scrawled onto bits of hide, carried by traders or sewn into hems. And still some watched the sky, not with dread, not waiting for it to darken again, but with attention. They marked the shape of the clouds, the length of the shadows, the tilt of the moon. They noticed when the stars blinked differently. They noticed when the rain came early or late. A new kind of wisdom was growing, not superstition, not prophecy, but observation. A science without the word, a discipline without formal name, because those who had survived knew that nothing could be trusted blindly, that seasons could lie, that light could vanish, that ash could fall in midsummer, but they also knew now that it could return. And in that knowing, they did not grow complacent. They prepared, always. Each year's harvest was still divided, some to eat, some to plant, some to hide. Each winter, they made sure the wood was stacked higher than the year before. Each spring, they sharpened their blades before turning the soil. But it was no longer from fear alone. It was from memory, from respect, from a deep, almost sacred understanding that to live was to listen to the land, not to command it. The old ways had not returned. They never would. But in their place, something new had taken root. Something quieter, more cautious, but perhaps stronger. A culture of resilience, a memory of the cold, stitched into every decision. And a long, slow promise that the future, though fragile, was no longer empty. By the 8th year, people no longer spoke of the darkness as if it might return tomorrow. They still remembered it, of course. How could they not? But the way they remembered had changed. It was no longer a fear wrapped tight around the stomach, no longer the shadow under every plan, every dream, every gesture. Now the memory had settled deeper, woven into the way they moved through the world. They did not forget the ash, but neither did they worship it. They carried it quietly the way old people carry their bones. Aching, yes, but known. Because it had been so long since they had seen anyone laugh like that. And yet, it wasn't only the children who changed. The elders, those whose backs were bent from years of carrying water and grief, began to speak differently too. Their stories grew longer, less sharp, filled with details they had once trimmed away because they hurt too much. They talked of their youth, of summers so warm the rivers steamed at dawn, of feasts with meat and music, of how the women used to wear colored ribbons in their hair just to make the days brighter. And when they spoke, the listeners no longer looked only for warnings, but for clues, for how to build again, not the old world, but something that honored what had been while admitting what had happened. In the ruins of cities once left for dead, small lights returned. Not torches of conquest or banners of restoration, but candles in windows, coals in hearths. Roofs were patched, not with new timber, but with old wood made to fit again. Doors were hung where there had been only cloth. Gardens grew in courtyards once filled with stone. Wells were cleaned, their stones scrubbed of moss and rot, and where once silence had settled over empty streets like dust, there was now the sound of footsteps, of hammering, of voices raised not in alarm, but in conversation. These reborn cities were not as they had been. They were smaller, tighter, more deliberate, no longer sprawling places of pride and ambition, but networks of careful need. People came not for power or glory, but because they had heard that there was grain here, that there were herbs, that the baker still worked his oven every 5th morning, that the cobbler had made a new pair of boots from scratch, that a woman in the eastern quarter could dye cloth the color of late summer moss. And even music returned to the streets. A flute player in the early morning, a trio of children tapping rhythm on old barrels, a woman humming beside her drying laundry. Music was no longer a performance. It was not meant to impress or distract. It was meant to fill the spaces that once echoed with fear. In monasteries, where knowledge had been guarded like flame in wind, the scribes began to copy more than scripture. They copied maps, even the ones thought out of date. They rewrote old planting guides with new notations. This root now grows here, or these hills no longer flood, or soil still poisoned in this valley. Wait another year. Their ledgers became part book, part prayer, part journal. They recorded not just what had happened, but how it had felt. The pain, the choices, the silences, and also the moments of quiet return. The first green bud on the 4th year. The stranger who shared half his onions. The way the snow melted all at once, not slowly, but in a single afternoon that felt like the end of something ancient. And far to the south, where the sun had always clung a little longer, the scholars began to share letters again, not just with nearby towns, but with places across mountains, across seas. The ships were fewer, smaller, slower, but they moved again, across salt water, across memory, across history, and on those ships came not only goods, grain, spices, dried fruit, wax, but stories of other lands that had darkened too, of other villages that had vanished, of temples whose bells had fallen and been melted down into plow blades, of kings who had gone silent, of empires that had not returned, but also stories of those who had endured, a monastery on a cliff that had kept bees alive through all 7 winters, a town in the north that had learned to fish through ice and taught the children how to build lines from bone, a valley where the sheep never died because the shepherds built them shelters with stone and moss. These were not fables. They were truths, passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, like seeds. And slowly, very slowly, the question shifted. It was no longer, will we survive? It became, what will we become? And the answers came not from councils or kings, but from quiet places. The baker's bench, the wheelwright's hammer, the herbwoman's satchel, the teacher's chalk. Not declarations, not decrees, but gestures, habits, movements repeated until they became patterns, until they became culture. And so the world did not turned. It did not resume what it had been. It became something new. By the 9th year, the earth had begun to hum again. Not in song, not in music, but in rhythm. A rhythm not of machines or conquest, but of breathing. Of water flowing again through ditches carved by calloused hands. Of firewood cracking in shared hearths. Of grinding stones turning under steady pressure. The rhythm of sowing and waiting, of weeding and watching, of gathering not in greed, but in thanks. It was not a rhythm known to kings, nor one taught in scrolls, but it was the oldest rhythm of all, the one known to soil and seed and skin. And those who remembered nothing but cold had learned how to follow it. It wasn't progress as the old world had measured it. No columns of numbers, no markets booming, no ships returning heavy with silk and silver. It was quieter, a different kind of progress, measured in children growing tall, in flocks multiplying without sudden death, in wells that stayed full after the rains, in fields that bore crops 2 years in a row, in neighbors who no longer hoarded, but knocked before entering. In this quieter time, people began to speak again of the sky, not to curse it or plead with it, but to read it, not with fear, but with reverence. They watched the shape of clouds the way monks watched ink dry on parchment. They marked the arrival of birds with dates carved into door frames. They traced the angles of sunlight across stone, trying to remember how long it had been since shadows had grown this long, this bold. The moon, once a distant ghost, now pulled the tide in its ancient pattern again. The stars returned, not just as pinpricks of light, but as companions, old names spoken in new mouths. And among the elders, those whose hair had grown white not from age but from the years of ash, there grew a new kind of role. Not leaders, not judges, but holders of memory. They were not the ones who gave orders. They were the ones who sat by the fire and answered when someone asked, "What was it like?" When everything stopped, they did not embellish. They did not dramatize. They told the truth, that it was dark, that it was quiet, that the birds were gone, that the air tasted of stone, that they buried more than they ever fed. But they also said, and then the frost stopped burning, and then the bread rose again, and then we heard the bees, and then your mother was born. In the smallest villages, schools reopened, though no one called them that. Just corners of halls where someone who could read sat with those who could not, letters scratched into wood or slate, numbers counted with pebbles and seeds. These children learned math by measuring flour. They learned writing by copying the names on grave markers. They learned history by listening, not to stories of war or kings or empires, but to how their neighbors had survived. They learned that endurance was a skill, that patience was power, that silence could teach. And when they wrote their own names, they did so with fingers that knew how to plant and sow and scrape and carry. And among them, new voices began to rise. Not loud, not forceful, but curious. A girl who wanted to know why some soils stayed wet longer than others. A boy who asked why the wind blew stronger after moonless nights. A child who asked if the darkness might return, and what they would do if it did. These were not the questions of fear. These were the questions of preparation. The questions of people who knew that peace was not given, but made. Over and over, like bread. Across the plains and valleys, stone was hauled again. Not for monuments or palaces, but for roads. For walls that could bear weight. For bridges that would not collapse in the thaw. Roads once overgrown with grass were cleared, not to connect capitals, but to bring grain to places where grain would not grow. Caravans formed, pulled by oxen and will. They carried more than goods. They carried words, news, songs, ideas, the shape of things to come. And among the traders, there were no longer lords or wealthy men. Only those who had survived. Those who had learned to sleep on frozen ground and chew bark when bread was gone. Their voices carried weight not because they owned land, but because they had endured it. And far in the east, where the mountains met the coldest rivers, a gathering was held, not of rulers or nobles, but of those who kept track, of those who had written down each year, who had watched the sky and measured the frost and recorded the return of each bird. They laid out scrolls on tables made from salvaged beams. They compared drawings of cloud shapes and counted rings on felled trees. They spoke not of punishment or prophecy, but of patterns, of cycles, of cause. One among them, a woman with a scar across her cheek and hands darkened by ink, said, "It began with fire beneath the earth," and others nodded and told of mountains that had burned far away, beyond the sea, beyond even the horizon. They spoke of ash that had circled the globe, carried by wind like a veil, of years without sun, of famines that were not punishment, but consequence. It was not a revelation, but it was a beginning, a first attempt to explain not with myth, but with memory. And so history began again, not to glorify, not to warn, but to understand. And in the west, in a fishing village where the tide finally rose high enough to carry the boats again, a child born just after the worst of it stood barefoot in the mud, staring up at the sky. Her mother told her the old stories. The sky had gone dark, the sun had vanished, the frost had taken everything. But the child only squinted and said, "But it came back," and her mother smiled, because that was what mattered now. By the 10th year, the word normal had changed its meaning. It no longer pointed backward toward the memory of the world before the skies dimmed, nor forward to some impossible dream of luxury and ease. Normal had become something lived in the present. Daily acts repeated with quiet dignity, not because they were easy, but because they were necessary. The sun did not always shine. The frost still lingered at odd hours. Storms still moved across the land with more anger than anyone remembered before the silence began. But people no longer flinched at these changes. They bent with them. They leaned into the weather like they did into the work. Eyes open, hands steady, nothing wasted. In the mornings, villages stirred not with bells or proclamations but with footsteps, the creak of doors, the sound of grain being ground, water drawn, bread started, would split, not rushed, not frantic, just practiced. Each task done with the calm of those who know how fragile the balance is, and how important it is to keep rhythm with the season. There were no schedules written down. Time moved by the shape of the sun and the scent of the earth. A full moon meant the laundry could be dried overnight. A south wind meant beans would need tying soon. The rhythm was no longer broken. It had been reshaped, and in that reshaping, beauty returned in unexpected places. In the way someone braided 3 colors of wool into a blanket not for sale, but because it pleased the eye. In the way a farmer arranged the stones around his well into a spiral, even though no one saw it but him. In the way a baker dusted the crust of her loaves with a simple leaf pattern, pressed in with the tip of a knife, just because it felt right. This was not vanity. It was memory at work. A memory that beauty had once been everywhere, and that now, even after the darkness, it could exist again, one small act at a time. In a town near the edge of an old, broken riverbed, someone built a bench. It was made of rough wood, nothing carved, nothing painted, but it was placed under the one tree that bloomed early every spring. People began to sit there, not to escape work, but to pause, to breathe, to speak sometimes, but more often just to sit, to listen to the leaves, to wait for the bees, to remember that the world, even quiet and altered and scarred, could still hold peace. Children grew up in this world not knowing it was new. They did not compare it to what had been lost. They did not mourn the taste of fruits they'd never known. They did not ask why the buildings leaned or why the bells no longer rang. They climbed the ruins as if they were hills. They played games using bones and feathers and seeds. They learned to read by candlelight and count by measuring flour. Their stories began not with once upon a time, but with after the ash, or when the sky came back, or simply, before my mother's first harvest. And these stories spread, not by scribes or messengers, but by mouths, by hands, by gestures, around fires, on riverbanks, in shared beds when sleep would not come, in the steady rhythm of spinning wheels. They became the new folklore, woven from fact and feeling, not to explain away the dark years, but to give them shape, so they could be remembered without fear, so they could be passed on without burning. And because people told these stories, they began to sing again. Songs without instruments at first, just voice and echo, old tunes repurposed with new words, lullabies that named lost seasons, working songs with rhythms that helped shoulders bear the weight. And eventually, slowly, instruments returned. A string across a hollow box, a bone flute drilled with care, a drum made from stretched hide and hope. Music crept back into corners and doorways and open skies, not loudly, not to be listened to in silence, but to accompany life itself. Trade deepened. What once had been barter became something more structured. Not formal, not enforced, but trusted. Tokens were exchanged. Marks were made in ledgers. People began to travel again, not only for food or necessity, but for curiosity, to see how others had survived, to learn how they had healed, to share what had worked and what had not. Along the old coastal roads, traders told of new fruit growing in warmer lands, a berry that could survive late frosts, a grain that ripened quickly. These stories mattered. They were like spells. When a village heard that a town far to the south had built an oven that wasted no wood, they copied it. When someone shared a trick for storing beans longer, the news passed from voice to voice, village to village, like wind. And behind all of it, beneath the carts, beneath the footsteps, beneath the voices, there was the soil which had been dead, or poisoned, or too cold to hold promise. Now it smelled alive again, dark and damp and deep. It held seeds the way a mother holds a sleeping child. Not tightly, not loosely, just right. And in that soil, hands moved not with desperation, but with purpose. Fingers pressed in beans, tucked in roots, raked in ash and compost and bone. They didn't speak while they worked. They didn't need to. They listened to the ground, and the ground listened back. And in some places, those bones were real. There were still graves unmarked, still places no one dared to till. Not from superstition, but from memory. They were left alone, not out of fear, but out of respect. Flowers were planted there, candles lit on certain days. Not every town remembered every name, but they remembered the number. They remembered the weight, because forgetting would mean it could happen again. And so, every act of planting was a prayer. Every harvest, a reply. We are still here. We are still growing. We remember you. By the 11th year, silence meant something different. It was no longer the stillness of fear, nor the hush of a world holding its breath in dread. It became something chosen, something earned. A pause between labors, a breath drawn between seasons, a space where grief no longer echoed, but settled like dust on old stone, soft and familiar. People still remembered the sound of the sky falling, of snow falling without end, of winds that howled through broken roofs. But they no longer lived in those sounds. They lived in the rustle of linen drying, in the shuffle of feet across packed earth, in the creaking of chairs built by hand, in the barely audible whisper of weeds being pulled from damp soil. The rhythm was no longer survival, it was life. There was a boy in the West who had never known hunger, not in the way his mother had. He had never sucked on bark to quiet his stomach, never counted crumbs, never cried in his sleep from cold. And yet he stood every morning before the oven where his mother baked and whispered a quiet greeting to the fire. No one told him to, he just did, because he had learned, somehow, that heat was a gift, that food was a covenant, that silence before a flame was not emptiness, but thanks. In another village, a man who had once lost everything became the keeper of tools. He did not sell them. He loaned them, a spade for 3 days, a hammer for 5, a rake for the season. He asked nothing in return but care. And every spring, people left him gifts. Not coins, not words, but the things that mattered. Eggs, a folded blanket, a spoon carved from driftwood, a pouch of salt. The man never smiled, but he never turned anyone away. It had taken more than a decade, but people had relearned how to trust slowly, without asking for proof. And as the trust grew, so did the stories. Not the stories of kings or gods or fires that split the sky, but of a woman who carried water every day for 5 years before she finally had enough to plant her first rose bush. Of a boy who walked 4 days to trade a single basket of beans and returned with 3 tin buttons and a smile. Of a grandmother who taught her neighbors to weave nets from grass, even though she had not fished in 30 years. These were not legends. They were truths, and they were told not to impress, but to remember. Language, too, had shifted. Some words were no longer used. No one spoke of wealth the way they once did. The word still existed, but it meant something closer to readiness, to warmth, to knowing that if one lantern went out, another could be lit. Other words had grown heavier. Ash, once a curse, was now a kind of blessing. Shadow, once something feared, now described the cool comfort of rest. Dark no longer meant death. It meant depth, waiting, the space where seeds lived before rising. People had stopped trying to name the years by kings or calendars. Instead, they called them what they were: the year of the heavy rain, the year the bees returned, the year of soft apples, the year of broken shoes, the year of the long ice, the year of the first dance. And now they called this one the year of the quiet sky, because the sky had, for the first time in over a decade, remained unchanged. No strange clouds, no sudden dimming, no ash, just sky. just stars, just sun. And in that quiet, things took root. Ideas that had been too fragile to survive the harsher years. A young woman in the north began teaching others how to read the movements of birds, how to watch the patterns of their return, how to mark their routes with symbols only she understood. She carved her notes into long wooden slats and bound them with cord. Her neighbors did not understand the markings, but they watched the birds more closely now, and they began to notice what she noticed. That some species had returned, others had not. That the birds flew differently before storms. That they nested later than before. She had not set out to become a scholar. She only wanted to know what would happen next. Elsewhere, two men who had once been rivals in trade began carving maps, not just to sell but to understand. They walked the old roads, marking every ruined bridge, every village returned, every river that had shifted course. They drew not in ink but in charcoal on wide skins of pressed bark, and they traded copies like others traded bread. Their maps were not perfect. They were always being redrawn, but each mark was a footprint, a signal, a whisper that the world was wide again. In the east, a council formed, not of leaders, not of priests, but of listeners. They traveled with no horses, no guards, only bags of paper and bundles of questions. They sat in markets and in courtyards and by ovens. They asked people how they had survived, what they had eaten, what they had feared, what had changed. They wrote everything down, not because they planned to publish or proclaim, but because it felt wrong to let these things vanish into wind. One woman in the group, whose hands shook when she wrote, said, "One day, they'll want to know how we lived," and the others nodded. That was the difference now. People were no longer only trying to survive the present. They were beginning to shape the future, not with grand declarations, but with small certainties. A loom built for a daughter, path cleared between two homes, a song taught to a child not yet able to walk, a bench built beneath a tree for someone tired, a map scratched into a table so travelers could trace where they had been. They knew the darkness might return. The sky had taught them never to forget that, but they had also learned that no sky, however dark, could erase every seed. And so they planted again. Always. By the 12th year, there were things no one spoke of anymore. Not out of denial, not out of shame, but out of weariness. The tally of the dead no longer needed to be repeated. The years of ash no longer needed explaining. The silence that once gripped entire valleys no longer needed retelling. It was understood, carried wordlessly in the way people looked at old trees that hadn't bloomed in a decade, in the way they cleaned the stones of abandoned homes without asking who had lived there. Grief had not disappeared, it had simply changed shape. It no longer cried out in the night. It sat quietly beside them, weathered and known, like the grain of the wood in their doors. Life was not easy, but it no longer felt like war. That was the difference. They did not win against the darkness. There had been no victory, no banner raised, no enemy named and vanquished. The sun did not return in triumph. It simply rose, day after day, until they no longer wondered if it would. And in that quiet consistency, people found breath again. They no longer moved as hunted creatures, but as caretakers, of soil, of stories, of each other. And in that caretaking, new things were born. A child in the south began collecting stones, not for building, not for defense, but for beauty. She lined them by color, by shape, by smoothness. Her father laughed at first, but when visitors came and saw the lines of red and blue and gray running along their garden, they asked if they might leave stones of their own. Within a year, the garden became a path, and the path became a custom. People left stones with symbols carved into them. Names, birds, spirals, dates, prayers. Not as graves, not as monuments, just presence. A way of saying, I was here, I saw this place, I left something. And elsewhere, the old songs began to change. What had once been hymns to the sun's return were now lullabies for the restless. Songs of planting, of waiting, of love given slowly. A woman in the mountains taught her granddaughter a tune with no words. Just a hum, low and warm, meant to be sung while kneading dough or brushing ash from the hearth. The tune traveled faster than any road. People began humming it in other valleys, other hills, without ever knowing where it came from. Simply arrived, like wind, like comfort. Some things did not need origin to be true. Tools were passed down more carefully now. A knife wasn't just a knife. It was a story of how many winters it had survived. A wooden bowl still blackened from a fire 8 years ago was no longer just a vessel but a reminder that the house had burned. And still they ate. A cloak mended 19 times became more than clothing. It became testament. People no longer prized the new. They prized the kept, the preserved, the rebuilt. They respected age, not for its power but for its proof. And in certain places, writing began to return in public. Walls of meeting halls were painted with dates and rain records and notes on harvests. Stones at the edge of fields were etched with tiny marks that recorded each planting, each failure, each success. In one town, the baker inscribed his measurements into the wooden table where he kneaded, and when others came to use it, they added their own. A little more salt in the wetter seasons, a little less yeast when the cold returned early. The table became a book, a collective scripture written in flour and memory. And some had begun to paint again, not on canvas, on walls, on fences, on door frames, not portraits, symbols, circles and rivers and animals and hands. Some said they were protective, others said they were messages, but most just painted because it felt necessary, because color had been gone so long, because the world had been gray and bone and dust. And now, slowly, it was blooming again, even if only in ochre, in charcoal, in the pink of crushed berries mixed with ash. Travel had changed too. No longer frantic, no longer desperate. Journeys were planned again, not for escape, but for knowledge. People walked long miles not to survive, but to see, to ask, to share. It became custom in some places for travelers to bring seeds, wrapped in cloth, tied with string, carried in pockets. Not for trade, for planting. You leave a seed where you have rested. That was the rule. A sign that you were fed, that you had warmed your hands by the fire, that you had been heard. Some travelers carried dozens, others only one. And the sky, that once terrifying canvas of doom, now offered familiarity. Not perfect. There were still strange winds, still sudden rains, but they no longer brought dread. People spoke of them like distant relatives. Unpredictable, inconvenient, sometimes harsh, but not enemies. Children lay in fields and traced the clouds without panic. Elders pointed out the stars they once thought gone forever. The moon was no longer watched for signs of death, but for her slow, silver comfort. Her presence was no longer a warning. It was a lullaby, and with this slow unfolding of trust in the sky came a return of time. Not measured in calendars or royal decrees, but in memory, in how long since the first bee, since the last frost, since the river thawed early. Time became a thing spoken in context. 2 harvests ago, when the goats gave twins, since she sang at the fire, time was a braid of personal history and communal rhythm. And in that, people learned how to plan again, not only for the week, but for the year. Not only for winter, but for what might come after. Hope was not shouted. It was planted. One seed at a time. By the 13th year, the pace of life no longer felt like recovery, it felt like living. Not rebuilding the old world, not reclaiming what had been lost, but breathing inside a new one, shaped not by architects or kings, but by repetition, by habit, by the way hands learned to work with what they had. The world had grown smaller, not by force, but by choice. People traveled, yes, but more often they stayed. They stayed because they knew the soil, because they knew the well, because they knew how long the sun clung to the western wall and how much wood the oven needed to bake the flatbread just right. And staying was no longer a kind of fear. It was a kind of belonging. In a village where the river had changed its path during the first flood years, people stopped trying to force it back. They built around the curve. They planted willows to hold the banks. They let the land reshape them as much as they shaped it. And when a traveler asked why the houses tilted, why the paths wound like ribbons instead of cutting straight, the locals only smiled. Because it no longer seemed strange to let the world speak first. Children born after the ash had their own ways. They did not flinch at shadows. They did not lower their voices when the wind rose. They asked questions with eyes wide open, not because they doubted the past, but because they could not imagine it. When the elders told them how the sun once vanished for weeks, they listened with a kind of reverent confusion, as if hearing about the time when animals spoke, or when fire was first discovered. They did not carry the memory, they carried the result. And perhaps that was the true sign that the world had turned. Not the harvests, not the warmer winters, not the longer days, but the questions of children who had never known despair. And with their questions came answers that no longer carried sorrow like a second voice. Now, when someone asked why a field was planted in rows not straight but curved, the answer was practical, because the slope keeps the water better this way. When a child asked why the bread was always cut into quarters, the answer came gently, because once there was not enough for fifths. When they asked why some names on stones were written in ash and some in carved letters, they were told, because those we lost quickly we named with what we had, and those who stayed longer gave us time to prepare. And no one cried when they said it, because the pain had been folded into the flour, kneaded into the bread, woven into the fabric, not hidden, not erased, just held. And because it was held, it no longer ruled them. In certain places, gatherings began again, not festivals in the old sense, not spectacles or markets, but quiet assemblies. People meeting under trees, beside streams, around fires, not just to trade goods, but to share what they had learned. How to preserve food with less salt. How to store water through a dry season. How to keep bees without losing them in the first frost. And amid the practical came the stories, about dreams people had during the worst years, about a white fox seen near the river every spring, about a song someone remembered their grandmother singing, one with no words, just hums that curved like water. The gatherings became traditions, not written down, not named, but remembered. When the moon was full and the weather soft, when the last frost had passed but the first fruits had not yet come, when the fields were quiet and the hands were ready to work again, those were the times they met. Some brought food, others brought tools to repair. One year, someone brought a bundle of dyed cloth and laid it out like a tapestry, and people pressed their palms into mud and then onto the fabric. A record not of names, but of touch. And slowly, again, people began to laugh. Not the forced laughter of those trying to banish fear, not the brittle laughter that follows disaster, but the low, rolling sound of contentment, of joy found in a moment not asked for, not expected. The laughter of someone who burned a loaf of bread because they were too busy singing. The laughter of children playing a game that made no sense but was played with such devotion that it didn't matter. The laughter of old friends remembering the worst nights and realizing they were still here, still arguing about which soup was best. The world had not grown safer. It had grown bearable. And in that bearability, people found room for detail again. A pot with a curled handle. A cloak sewn with 2 colors of thread. A knife with a pattern in its blade not made by need, but by thought. These details did not slow the work. They honored it. They said, I am not only surviving, I am shaping. I am not only eating, I am noticing. I am not only walking, I am watching where my foot touches the ground. There were still those who remembered the first days, who remembered the snow that wasn't snow, the cold that came without warning, the clouds that hung too low, and they still told those stories, not to frighten, not to impress, but so the ground would not forget what had happened upon it. They told of the animals that vanished, of the plants that never returned, of the names no one could speak for years, and then they told what came after, the first thaw, the first shoot, the first voice raised in song again, the first hand held not in fear, but in promise. They told of how the world had stopped, and then started again. By the 14th year, people no longer looked up at the sky expecting an answer. They had learned that the sky did not speak in words, nor in signs, nor in punishments. It moved according to forces too vast to name, too slow to plead with. And so they stopped asking the sky to change, and instead they changed around it. They no longer treated the sun as a certainty. They treated it as a companion, sometimes near, sometimes hidden, always indifferent but always returning. And that was enough. They no longer cursed the rain when it came without warning. They walked through it, heads bowed, cloaks drawn tight, and when it passed, they did not complain. They just wrung out their sleeves and moved forward. There was a steadiness in people now that hadn't existed before. Not passivity, not dullness, but endurance shaped into patience, and patience shaped into wisdom. The kind of wisdom that doesn't rush to speak or act or even decide. The kind of wisdom that waits until the last coals have cooled before sweeping the hearth. That waits 3 days after a wound closes to trust that it will stay closed. That waits a full season before calling anything lost. In the center of a valley once drowned by floodwaters, people rebuilt not their homes, but their gardens. They did not plant the same crops as before. They watched which plants had returned on their own and planted alongside them. They left spaces where wild herbs grew in tangled spirals, because the bees liked those best. They planted trees not for fruit but for shade, not for wood but for rest. They did not try to tame the land. They tried to befriend it. Children learned not from schools, but from rhythm. They learned by carrying water with their elders, by weaving reeds into baskets, by watching shadows move across floors. They learned time from the way wool changed in their fingers. They learned math by counting eggs that didn't always arrive. They learned balance by walking on the backs of old stone walls. And they learned resilience from the way their parents exhaled slowly when bad news came. Not panicked, not collapsed, just quiet and ready to begin again. And because of that, a new kind of strength grew. Not loud, not visible, not written into muscles or laws, but in the quiet resolve of people who knew how far they had fallen and how far they had climbed. They no longer looked for heroes. They looked for good neighbors. They no longer waited for salvation. They learned how to save each other in small, continual ways. In one town, people took turns repairing the walking bridge across the stream. No one was assigned. No one was thanked. They just did it, because they remembered the year when the bridge collapsed and no one could cross, and someone died on one side while medicine sat untouched on the other. No one told that story anymore, but no one forgot it either, and so the bridge remained strong. And in another place, a small tradition had begun. On the coldest night of the year, families left bowls of hot broth outside their doors. Not for anyone specific, just in case someone was walking past. Most years, no one took them, but every year the bowls were filled. Because once, long ago, someone had been saved by a bowl like that. They had never learned who made it, but they had lived, and so now others did the same. The stories passed down in these years were not of glory. They were not of conquest or fame. They were stories of mending, of staying, of showing up, of a roof patched with bark because there was no tar, of boots made from old cloaks, of a wedding held with no feast, just bread and firelight and a string tied around 2 hands, and of how that couple stayed married 40 winters, even when the harvest failed twice and their 3rd child was born in silence. Because now, people understood that survival wasn't only about food or shelter or heat. It was about memory held gently, about grief carried without letting it rot the heart, about choosing to return to the same cold ground day after day, believing that eventually, something green would rise from it again. They believed in seeds, not in theories, not in empires, not in progress, in seeds, in the way a seed split open in darkness, in the way it pushed upward even through stones, in the way it waded through drought and still held life. And that belief, more than any temple, more than any flag, became sacred. So they gathered seeds now not just for planting, but for sharing, for giving, for guarding, small bundles tied with fiber, placed in cloth pouches, marked with notched wood or ink. Some held only 3 or 4, some had hundreds, but each one said the same thing: the world is not done. We are not finished. Life does not end when it changes shape. There were still hard winters, still failed harvests, still illness, still sorrow. But now, when someone died, the neighbors did not turn away in fear. They came with wood, with cloth, with fire, with hands. They buried their dead not with mourning alone, but with thanks. Because now, to live long enough to be buried by loved ones was not tragedy. It was miracle, and slowly even language healed. Words that had once vanished came back, timid at first, like deer in the woods. Celebration, welcome, dance, hope, not shouted, not written into songs, just spoken. I hope the snow doesn't come too early. Welcome, I saved you a seat. We danced last night. Quiet words, everyday words, but heavy with meaning, because now people knew how much silence had once cost. By the 15th year, the memory of fire no longer brought only fear. People still remembered how it had begun, not in warmth but in hunger, not in light but in the dark, when smoke rose from mountains no one had named, and ash fell like snow across kingdoms that thought themselves eternal. But now fire had returned to its place. Cooked food, softened wool, it baked bricks, it burned the brush in spring to prepare the fields. Fire was no longer a force that swallowed the world. It had become, again, a tool, a friend, a keeper of warmth in the months when frost still came uninvited, and when children sat near it, listening to stories that began not with heroes but with seasons. They saw not the end of all things, but the beginning of something tender, something strange, something stubbornly alive. They watched the sparks rise like stars that dared to fall upwards. They listened to the creak of logs and the soft sigh of smoke curling beneath the rafters. They did not know fear the way their elders had, but they knew reverence. In the northern forests, where the trees had thinned during the long famine years, saplings now grew in the shadows of their dead. No one planted them. They arrived on their own, carried by wind, by birds, by chance. And instead of clearing them, people began to protect them. Children were taught to recognize the first signs of green along the trunks, to mark where the deer rubbed their antlers, to watch for the mushrooms that only grew where the soil had healed. Forests, like people, did not return in a day. They returned by inches. And in the cities, what little remained of them, people no longer tried to resurrect what had collapsed. They walked the bones of towers without shame. They planted gardens in crumbled amphitheaters. They dried fish on marble steps that once led to temples. They carved wells where fountains had once sprayed water only for show. The stone no longer spoke of glory. It spoke of adaptation, of humility, of endurance. And within those spaces, something even more unexpected returned. Curiosity. Not ambition, not conquest, but wonder. There was a boy who asked why the river turned red after the first rain. No one knew, so they followed it upstream, found the clay, found the iron, found the places where water had shifted since the quakes. There was a girl who asked why some trees never lost their leaves. So they watched them through the winter, counted the days, noticed how the snow melted faster beneath them. Their questions did not seek control. They sought understanding. And slowly that understanding spread not through books but through hands, through practice, through trial. A woman in the lowlands learned to cure meat with smoke from a certain type of bark. She told one person. That person told two. 10 years later, the method had a name. Not hers. But that didn't matter. The knowledge had outlived the fire. Some communities began to keep track again. Not of kings, not of debts, but of stars. They marked their positions on wooden discs. They carved calendars not to measure taxes, but to know when to plant peas, when to move sheep, when to expect frost on the eastern side of the roof. They watched the moon with soft attention. They counted the days between eclipses, not out of fear, out of rhythm. And in those rhythms, people began to build new myths, not to explain the ash, but to give shape to the years that came after. They told stories of seeds that sang beneath the soil, of animals that guarded sleeping towns, of the sky as a grandmother who covered the world with her shawl, sometimes too thick, sometimes too thin, but always meaning well. These myths did not seek control. They offered comfort, and in places where nothing had grown for a decade, flowers returned. Not many, not all at once, but enough to be noticed. A yellow bloom by a ruined wall, a purple stem curling through cracked stone, a cluster of white petals beneath a scorched tree. No one knew their names anymore. The old books were gone, but they gave them new names, Hope flower, frost petal, ash root. Names spoken gently, reverently, as if to speak them too loudly might scare them back into the ground. Even language had softened. People no longer used words like forever. They said things like as long as it lasts. They said things like if the rains come, like when the sun is strong enough. Not from doubt, from experience. They no longer made promises they could not keep. They made meals. They made blankets. They made time. And when strangers came, travelers, traders, the curious, they were not met with suspicion. They were asked where they came from, what they carried, whether they had seeds, whether they had songs. They were fed. They were listened to. And when they left, something of them remained. A tune, a recipe, a way of stitching cloth so it did not fray in the wash. Because now, the world was made not of stone or law or border. It was made of memory passed hand to hand. It was made of quiet acts repeated often. It was made of eyes meeting across firelight, not with fear, but with recognition. And it was made of the understanding, deeper than any written truth, that nothing good lasts forever, but neither does darkness. Everything returns in time if you leave space for it. By the 16th year, there were those who had lived more of their lives after the darkness than before it. They no longer measured time by what had been lost, but by what had lasted, by how many winters the orchard had survived, by how many calves had been born since the soil softened, by how many children had learned to read the sky not with dread, but with wonder. And slowly, without anyone declaring it, without celebration or bells or banners, the age of ash came to an end, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer defined them. The memory remained, but it no longer controlled the shape of their days. They built slowly, without plans for empires, without visions of glory. They built because roofs were needed, because shelves held jars better than floors, because windows gave warmth and light and wind in just the right measure. A town that once had 50 streets now had 6. But those 6 were lined with herbs and tools and benches and footsteps. No one missed the missing 44. They no longer mourned what they didn't need. And the nights were no longer feared. Children played beneath stars that their parents had once prayed would return. They chased each other with lanterns, their laughter echoing between walls that had once held only silence. In the evenings, people sang, not loudly, not to perform, but together. One voice would begin, a second would join, a third would hum the harmony, not trained, not rehearsed, just remembered. The songs weren't always about joy. Sometimes they were about patience, about the rain, about the fire that had taken too much. But the songs were steady, and they were shared, and that was enough. There was a woman who planted sunflowers at the edge of the oldest ruins. No one asked her to. She just did. 1 stalk the first year, 3 the next, then a row, then a field. And each year they stood taller, even though the wind battered them, even though the soil still held traces of the cold. People began leaving stones beneath them, smooth, round, marked with the initials of someone gone. Not for mourning, for remembrance, so the names would live where the sun returned. There were no more kings. There were elders. There were no more laws written in stone. There were customs written in gesture, in the way bread was offered without asking, in the way doors were left open on the warmest nights, in the way no one ever ate the last of anything without offering it around first. Justice was no longer weighed in scales. It was weighed in trust, in memory, in knowing who had come through the worst and still chosen kindness. And there were books again. Not many, not yet, but enough. Scraps of bark, pressed paper made from reeds, ink from soot and vinegar, letters copied by hand, not for commerce, not for power, for remembering, a list of plants that cured fever, a record of star patterns, a set of stories told at every equinox, written down so children could read them when no elders were left to speak them aloud. One book simply held names, thousands of them, first names only, names of the lost, names of the born, names of those who lived through it all and died with their hands still open. There was no monument to what happened in 536. There was only the earth, and it held everything, the ash, the bones, the roots, The breath of those who knelt in fields and pressed their fingers to the soil, not to beg, but to promise. We will not forget. We will not rush. We will not build what cannot bend. We will be small and careful and many. And when the wind comes again, we will turn our faces to it, not to resist, but to listen. Because the world does not owe us kindness, but it offers us space. And in that space, slowly, wordlessly, they built a life that was not the same as before. Not brighter, not richer, not safer, but more real. A life that asked for nothing but care. A life that gave back what it could. A life that knew the worst year in human history had come and gone. And that still they were here, still breathing, still growing, still listening to the sky.